A racist cop wrongfully arrests a black lawyer, thinking she's just another ordinary citizen, not knowing she's a top attorney ready to fight back. What happens next will turn the tables. Subscribe to see the shocking outcome and comment where you're watching from. It was supposed to be a routine stop, but what happened next changed everything. Officer Greg Wilson, a seasoned cop in a small town in Texas, prided himself on being able to read people. He believed he could tell who was in trouble just by looking at them. Today, his assumptions were about to get him into more trouble than he could have ever imagined. It was mid-afternoon when he spotted a sleek black car parked on the side of the road near a busy courthouse. The driver, a young black woman dressed sharply in a navy blue pantsuit, was looking through some papers on her lap. To Greg, she didn't belong there. Something about her car, her confidence, her presence, it all felt wrong to him. He didn't need a reason. In his mind, she had to be up to something. Without hesitation, he pulled his patrol car alongside hers, turning on his flashing lights. The woman inside didn't flinch. She calmly rolled down her window and looked up at him with a neutral expression. "License and registration," Greg said, his tone sharp. He wasn't asking, he was demanding. The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. She reached into her purse, pulled out her ID, and handed it to him. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Her name, printed clearly on the ID, was Rachel Carter. Greg barely glanced at it before he started making assumptions. "This car doesn't seem like it's yours," he said, ignoring her question. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly. "I don't see how that's relevant, but for your information, I'm reviewing my case notes. I have a hearing at the courthouse shortly." Greg's suspicions only grew. He thought she was bluffing, trying to cover something up. He'd seen people lie before, and to him, she was no different. "Step out of the car," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Rachel hesitated for a moment, but she knew better than to escalate the situation. She opened her door and stepped out, standing tall and composed. "I've done nothing wrong, officer," she said, "but I'll cooperate." Greg didn't care about her cooperation. To him, her confidence was arrogance on it, and it only made him more determined to prove her guilty of something, anything. He began searching her car without permission, rifling through her belongings while Rachel stood on the curb, arms crossed. "Do you have a warrant for this search?" she asked, her tone still measured. Greg ignored her, pulling out a briefcase from the back seat. He opened it and found neatly organized legal documents. It didn't faze him. He thought it was a front, a way to hide illegal activities. "You're a lawyer?" he scoffed, his disbelief clear. "I've never seen a lawyer like you." Rachel's jaw tightened. She had faced comments like this before, but it didn't make them any easier to hear. "Yes, I am," she said firmly, "and unless you have probable cause, this search is illegal." Greg smirked. "Probable cause? I don't need your advice on how to do my job." He didn't stop, determined to find something incriminating. When he didn't, he resorted to the one thing he thought would intimidate her: arrest. "You're under arrest," he said, pulling out his handcuffs, "for obstruction of justice." Rachel stared at him in disbelief. "Obstruction? I haven't done anything except ask for my rights to be respected." Greg didn't answer. He cuffed her and led her to his patrol car as a small crowd began to gather. People whispered among themselves, some pulling out their phones to record the scene. Rachel stayed calm, knowing her best chance at justice was to let the system work. But she also knew this wasn't the end, not even close. As she sat in the back of the patrol car, Rachel's mind raced. She wasn't just any lawyer. She was one of the top civil rights attorneys in the state. And now, the very laws she had dedicated her life to upholding were being used against her. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been wrongly profiled, disrespected, or silenced. By the time they reached the station, Rachel had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't just an arrest. It was an opportunity to expose the very prejudice she fought against every day. And Officer Greg Wilson was about to learn just how much power she truly had. At the station, Rachel sat calmly in the holding area, her hands still cuffed in front of her. She watched as Greg filled out paperwork at the desk, his demeanor smug. To him, this was a routine arrest. Another person put in their place. What he didn't realize was that he hadn't just arrested a lawyer. He had just arrested someone who knew the law better than he did. After what felt like hours, Rachel was finally brought into a small interrogation room. Greg sat across from her, a cocky grin on his face. "So you want to tell me the truth now? What were you really doing back there?" Rachel met his gaze, calm but unwavering. "I already told you. I was preparing for my hearing at the courthouse. Every single thing you've done since pulling me over has been illegal, but I'll save the explanation for court." Greg scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You think you're smarter than me because you read a few law books? Let me tell you something. People like you think you can get away with anything, but not on my watch." Rachel tilted her head slightly, her composure unshaken. "People like me? What exactly do you mean by that, Officer Wilson?" Greg's face reddened, realizing his slip. "You know what I mean," he muttered. Rachel didn't press further. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done, and she knew the truth would come out soon enough. She leaned back in her chair, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to Greg's growing frustration. Moments later, the door to the interrogation room opened. Another officer stepped in, his expression tense. "Greg, we need to talk," he said, motioning for Greg to step outside. Greg frowned but followed the officer out, leaving Rachel alone in the room. Outside, the second officer's voice was low but firm. "You know who you just arrested, right?" Greg rolled his eyes. "Yeah, some woman who thinks she's above the law." The officer shook his head, clearly annoyed. "That woman is Rachel Carter. She's a top civil rights lawyer, and she's handled cases against departments like ours. Do you realize what kind of trouble you've just walked us into?" Greg froze. The name finally clicked. He had seen her on the news before, winning high-profile cases and exposing systemic issues in law enforcement. His confidence began to crumble. "You're kidding, right?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "I wish I were," the officer said. "And guess what? Her father's a prominent judge. If she decides to file a lawsuit, this could go national." Greg swallowed hard. "What do I do now?" The officer sighed. "Apologize, release her, and pray she doesn't destroy your career." Back in the room, Rachel waited patiently. She wasn't angry. She was strategic. She knew her power wasn't in yelling or making threats. It was in letting the system work in her favor, showing Greg and anyone watching that she wasn't someone to be underestimated. When Greg re-entered the room, his arrogance was gone, replaced with visible unease. He sat down across from her, avoiding eye contact. "Miss Carter, there's been a misunderstanding." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? You mean when you profiled me, illegally searched my car, and arrested me without cause?" Greg winced at her directness, but nodded. "I realize now that I may have acted, improperly. You're free to go." Rachel leaned forward slightly. "Improperly? That's an interesting way to put it, Officer Wilson. You violated my rights, but I appreciate your acknowledgement, even if it's late." Greg stood, awkwardly fumbling with the keys to remove her cuffs. Once they were off, Rachel stood, straightening her suit. She didn't rush to leave. Instead, she paused at the door, turning to face him one last time. "I hope this experience teaches you something, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You can't judge people by their appearance. And the next time you think about bending the law to fit your assumptions, remember today. Remember me." Greg nodded silently, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. Rachel walked out of the station, her steps purposeful, her head held high. Outside, she was greeted by a small group of reporters who had already caught wind of the situation. She answered their questions with poise, carefully framing the narrative to focus on the systemic issues she had encountered. "This isn't just about me," she told them. "This is about the countless others who don't have the platform or resources to fight back. We need accountability, not just for individual officers, but for the systems that allow this behavior to continue." As the story gained traction, Rachel didn't waste the opportunity. She filed a formal complaint against Greg, ensuring that his actions would be reviewed. But she didn't stop there. She used the incident to push for broader reform, organizing community meetings and advocating for better training programs for law enforcement. For Greg, the fallout was swift. An internal investigation was launched, and his reputation was tarnished. The very confidence that had fueled his actions that day was now his downfall. He became a cautionary tale within the department, a reminder of what happens when bias takes precedence over justice. For Rachel, it was another victory, not just for herself, but for the principles she stood for. She didn't just walk away from the experience. She turned it into a platform for change, proving once again that the law wasn't just words on a page. It was a shield, a weapon, and a tool for those brave enough to wield it.